Hello and welcome to part 14 of Let's Create a 2D Platformer in the Godot game engine. My name is Colin, and in this tutorial, not so mini series, we're creating this 2D platformer video game. Of course, in this game, you control the player on screen using keys on your keyboard. Of course, you can walk, run, jump, and fall. You collect coins to win the game. You can get hurt by enemies and lose lives. You can also squash enemies, find keys to unlock doors, do wall jumps, shoot fireballs. You know how 2D platformer games work. So in this tutorial, in part 14, we're going to be handling enemy collisions. That means when your player comes into contact with the enemy, if you're hitting the enemy from the side, you will get hurt. You will turn red and bounce in one direction or the other. And if you jump on the enemy from the top, well, that's how you squash the enemy. The enemy will change appearance to look squashed, and then you will do a little bounce off of the enemy automatically, and the enemy will disappear after a moment. So we'll be handling those things in this video. Of course, this is part 14 of this mini-series. If you have not seen the first 13 parts of this mini-series and how to create a 2D platformer game in the Godot game engine, I'll put a link to this whole playlist containing all of my Godot 3 tutorials up on the screen right now. But let's go ahead and jump into the Godot editor. Of course, if you like this video or if you learned something in it, please go ahead and click on that like button below this video. It really helps out me and my channel. If you want to see more videos like this one in the Godot game engine or in Blender or other technology, click on that subscribe button as well and click the bell icon to be notified whenever I upload a new tutorial. So as it stands in our project right now, of course, we have our little character. I've added 3 little blob characters into my scene, and some of these blob enemy characters, if I select each one of them, you'll see that I might have customized each one a little bit in terms of its direction. So if direction is set to 1, it'll go to the right. If the direction is set to -1, it will go to the left. So they can all be a little bit different or have a different start direction. Likewise, I can turn detects cliffs on and off. If you've not seen my last video in this mini-series, part 13, in which we started creating the enemy as well as the enemy behaviors, I'll put a link to that tutorial up on the screen right now. You can check that out by clicking the card up in the top right corner, most likely. So in this video, we're going to handle enemy collisions because right now, if I press the play scene button, well, of course, my game will launch. And if I get in the way of my enemy, well, the enemy is smart enough to know to turn in the opposite direction if it hits a wall, but that's all it considers my player right now is just a wall. There are no enemy collisions in terms of getting hurt or squashing the enemy. So these enemies don't do a whole lot except for, of course, change direction on a cliff or a wall. The cliff if that option is set up. So let's go ahead and jump into our enemy scene. I have 3 enemies. I can click on any one of these little icons to jump into and open up the enemy's original scene. What we're going to be doing here is we're going to be adding some area 2Ds to either side of the enemy, which will do the job of hurting you, the player, because when you hit the enemy from the side, of course, you get hurt as the player. And then we're going to add an area 2D above the enemy, and that will determine if the enemy should get squashed, if you are jumping on and squashing the enemy. So I'm going to select my root node of the enemy scene, and I'll press plus. I'm going to do a search for area 2D, and if I search up there for that text, of course, I'll find it right here. I'll double click. You might also have area 2D in your recents as well. So I will double click. This is going to be my top checker because this is going to detect if you are jumping on and squashing the enemy. So this area 2D, I'm going to double click on its name and I'm going to call it top underscore checker. And I'll press enter, and of course it gives us a little error because area 2Ds need a shape. In this case, we're going to be using, of course, a collision shape. So I'll press OK, I'll select my top checker, I'll press plus, I'll search for collision, and I'll choose collision shape 2D, the blue one, not the pink one, of course. So I'll double click. This collision shape, I'm going to go over with it selected to the inspector where I can choose a shape. So I'll click the little arrow and I will say a rectangle shape 2D. And then I get this new square here. I'm going to drag it up. And as soon as I start dragging, I will hold Control on my keyboard or Shift. I don't think it really matters. Control or Shift will make it kind of go up and down without moving side to side. Once you start moving it, I'm going to make this a little bit shorter. And I'm going to drag it up and hold shift again. I'm not going to have these 2 parts overlap, but I am going to make this area 2D a little bit narrower than the actual shape of the kinematic body physics shape. So this main area is the collision shape of the physics object, and to it we're just basically adding little zones that are going to detect the player, and this is going to be the one for squash. So I'll make it a little bit narrower like that. I'm happy with its size. By the way, at the end of the last video I didn't have my enemy animation turned on. So right now you can see that this enemy is squashing up and down. If I select the animated sprite, I just forgot in the last video to turn playing on. Okay, I just turned it on, and that means that all the enemies will be doing their squashed or their crawl animation, which I have selected here, and that crawl animation only has 2 frames, and it's going at 3 frames per second. So we have our top checker. What I'm going to do now is use a signal to detect if a object is colliding with this top checker. Before I do that though, I want to make sure the collision layers and masks are set up properly. So this top checker, I'm going to go with it selected over to the inspector to the collision section. We have to set up our collision layers and masks, of course. This top checker is not a player, so I'll uncheck that. It is an enemy. Category of object. Okay, it's part of the enemy. And under collision masks, this is what this object can collide with. Of course, we want it to collide with players. That's what we want. And maybe fireballs. We'll see about that later when we make fireballs in a future video. Okay, so I'm kind of happy with that. Platforms, no. Fall zones, no. Items, enemies, no. Just players and fireballs. Let's go ahead now and create a signal on this top checker. So I'll select the top checker, go over to my node tab, go to the signals kind of section of that. We're going to check to see if a body enters this Area2D. So I'm going to double click on body entered and not body exited or something else. We want to use body entered. I'll double click and I will select the enemy because we're going to put the code that this signal is going to call to run. The function that we're going to be creating is going to be called on top checker body entered. It's a long name, but it's pretty self-explanatory if you read it out and think about it. We want that code to be on the enemy itself. So I'll click on enemy and press connect. When I do that, of course, I'll zoom in on my code. I get a function that is pointed to. You can see this little icon here. It's pointed to by the signal. And this is what we want to happen if the character enters this top checker Area2D. What do we want to happen? Well, we want the animated sprite of the enemy to switch to its squashed animation. If I select it and go over to the sprite frames dock at the bottom, we have a crawl animation, which is its little walk. We have a squashed animation. It's just got 1 frame. It'll make it look like it's squashed. So I'm going to go back to my enemy's code and I'm going to say, well, I have to access the animated sprite. So I'll type animated sprite. There we go. It knows what we're talking about here. It knows what the child nodes are. And I'm going to say dot play, which is a method call. So you have to put little round brackets, and I'm going to put in quotes squashed. And I'm not sure why it didn't predict that for me, but I know what it was called. If you need to double check, you can go back to the animated sprite and look for its name right there, squashed, all lowercase. That makes it easy. Okay, so now if I do a Control S to save, go back to my level 1, I will go back to my 2D workspace and I will press play. Because, by the way, we edited the code of our enemy, which exists primarily inside of the original enemy scene. This will now affect all of the enemies, which is great. It propagates out to all of the instances, enemies 1, 2, and 3. So great, I'll press play scene. And now if I jump on an enemy, bam, the enemy gets squashed. But we have a problem. It is still going to be a physics body. That means I can land on it and it's still moving and it's not disappearing. So what I want to do here is I want to have the enemy stop. And that means I need to change its speed and set its speed to 0. So let's go ahead and handle that. I'm going to go back to my enemy scene and my enemy's script. We have our enemy always moving at a velocity of 50 or -50, depending on its direction. And this is happening at 60 times per second because this code is in our physics process delta, our game loop. This is a hard-coded number. We want to try to get away from those generally. So I'm going to put a variable at the top of my code. I'm going to type var speed. I'm going to make speed equal to what we want, 50. And now I'm going to use that variable speed in place of this literal hard-coded number here, speed. Therefore, it'll act the same, but now we can change the value of this variable from somewhere else. And that's exactly what I want. So when my character enters the top body checker or the top checker, I want to change the speed of this whole script file. So speed is going to be equal to 0. I want to stop the enemy in its tracks. Okay, so if I press Control S to save and I go back to my level 1 and I press play scene, well, hopefully now when I squash the enemy, it'll stop. Okay, but notice how the other enemies keep going because I haven't squashed each one of them. So now if I squash this one, well, there we go. The next problem is that we want the enemy to no longer be collidable with our player. So let's think about this for a second. If I squash an enemy, of course, now it stops, and that's great, but I can still land on it, and that's not great. So what I want to do here is I want to access each, or the enemy that I squashed, and if I select one of them in my level 1 and I go to the inspector, well, it has collision layers and masks set up. What I want to do here is, well, I want to probably turn off, because my player's collision layers are set up and its collision masks are set up to see enemies in the scene. On the enemy that I squashed, I probably want to remove the enemy from its own layer so that the player can't see that enemy anymore. And I probably want to change the collision mask because I don't want the enemy to be able to see the player anymore. So I want to turn off essentially that one and that one. But don't do what I just did. Don't turn off and don't modify these layers and masks on the individual instances of the enemy. Don't do that. You'll get yourself into a world of problems. So what I'm going to do here is I'll go into my enemy scenes script of the root node. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to, when our player enters this top checker area 2D down here, I'll actually go down here and I'll press enter a few times so this code isn't so low down on my screen, and I'll make it bigger. What I want to do is I want to play with and turn off those two layers, the collision layer and the collision mask. So we are right now working on the enemy's code. That means it'll affect the entire enemy instance that we are working on. So I'm going to say set underscore collision, and I'm going to say set collision layer bit. And this is a method call, and I'm going to turn one of those squares, one of those bit values to false. Which one? Well, if I select the root node and I go over to this layer, if I hover over the one that's on for enemy, remember I want to make this enemy no longer an enemy or no longer in its enemy layer, it is bit 4, okay, because it starts counting from 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4. So that's bit 4, and so I'm going to turn that to false. So I will say 4, false. I also want to remove this enemy's ability to see the player. And if I go back to my enemy and go back to its masks, I want to turn off this mask bit, which is the player, and it is bit 0. Okay, so I'm going to go to my enemy's code and I'm going to do almost the same thing. We've seen it before, set collision mask bit. And so that's what it looks like. And we're going to be turning off bit 0. And because we're turning it off, we will set it to false. And I'll just confirm that it is bit 0. And because that is the player layer that it is looking for. Okay. We also have children of the enemy. In other words, this top checker that has its own collision layers and its collision mask. So on this top checker, I'm going to disable it as well by turning off its same layer bit 4 to false and mask bit 0 to false as well. So on my enemy, what I'm going to do is, again, when my player enters that top zone, I'm going to say $, and I'm going to say top checker dot set. I can actually copy and paste this, Control C, and I'll paste that there instead. So I'm turning off the ability for it to be in its own layer. And so I will do the same thing again, $top checker dot, and I'll copy this because we're going to turn off its collision mask so it doesn't see the player anymore. And I think that should work. Let's go ahead and try that out. If you need to pause the video, please do get the code out for yourself. I will do a Control S to save, but I will go back to level 1. It's not saved. I'll Control S and I'll press play scene with level 1 selected. And so now if I go and land on an enemy, you see that it no longer bumps into my player. Now, my Steve character, I did this between the last video and this video. My Steve object is the last thing in my level 1 node tree in the main branch. I believe as of the last video, this Steve was actually up here. It was just below the parallax background. And if that's the case for you, if your enemies are lower down on this list than your Steve, well, they will be in front. And that might not be what you want. So if I go and do the same thing now, if I walk around, you can see that I go behind the enemy is on top. Well, I can just fix that by dragging Steve down there. And I don't want Steve to be in the enemies folder, so I'll just do a little bit of reorganization here. And there we go. So now it works the way that we want. And can I squash other ones too? It's going to be hard for me to squash that upper one because it's on a platform and I'll just jump through the top if I try jumping from here. In other words, it just jumps up. So it's hard for me to squash enemies that are on there. I hope you understand that. So I think we are doing good. We are squashing the enemies. The enemies are no longer going to collide with us when we squash them. But what about the enemies hurting us? Well, let's go back to the enemy scene and I'll select the root node because to it, I'm going to add another Area2D. So I'll select the root node. I'll press plus. I'll search for Area2D. I'll double click to add that. The Area2D, we're going to name Sides Checker. And I think that makes sense. We're going to do both sides at the same time. Of course, it needs a collision shape. So with it selected, I'll press plus. I will search for collision and I'm going to select and add a collision shape. So I'll double click on that. This collision shape is going to go through this area and it's not going to be quite as tall as the actual physics body just because we don't want things to kind of get too close to one another. So the collision shape, I've got it selected for my size checker. I will add a new rectangle shape 2D resource to it. I'll move it down a little bit. I'll hold shift or control as I do that. I'll make this a bit wider. I'll make this a little bit taller. I think we're doing pretty good here. Let's drag it down a little bit and hold control. And maybe I'll make it a little bit shorter. Now, if you have this too narrow like that, it might not work properly. And in fact, by the time your character is moving, if it's moving fast enough, your character, it might actually collide with the size checker, but it also might hit the top checker. So you might want to make this a little bit wider than you think you need, and you might want to edit the top checker's collision shape to make it a little bit narrower. Okay, but if you make it so narrow and then you jump on the side of your top of your enemy, it might not detect you jumping on it. So you kind of have to play a balancing game here. So this sides checker, we need to set up its collision layers and masks. It is not a player. It is going to be an enemy, and its mask is going to be looking for players and fireballs, I believe. I think that's what we have on the top checker as well. So yes, that's what we want. Now we might in a moment run into a problem because right now our sides checker thinks of itself as an enemy. And I believe if two things are on the same collision layer, even if their masks aren't set up to do so, I believe they might detect each other. So because this Area2D is considered on the enemy layer, and because our enemy itself, in other words, the main physics body collision shape, is also on that same enemy layer, the Area2D might always detect itself entering it, and that might cause a problem. So we might have to deal with that in a moment. But for now, if you need to get that set of layers and masks, there it is. But I'm going to select my sides checker now, and we'll set up the signal. So with it selected, I'll go over to my node dock, and I'll go to under signals. We want to detect a body entering this area. So I'll double click on body entered, and it will make a new function called on sides checker body entered. That's a long name, but again, it makes sense. I'm going to select the enemy node because that's where our code is, and I'll press connect. It makes a new function at the bottom. I don't need so many lines there, so I'll get rid of that. It's called, again, on sides checker body entered. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to do a print out to my output section to see what happens or see how often this is going to happen. So I'm going to do a print method call. And this, again, will just write whatever text we want down here into the output. This print method call is a good way of checking to see when a function is running or when certain code is running. You can put this pretty much anywhere in your code, and it should do its job. It should print at some point, depending on where you put it, of course. So print, and again, it is a method call, so it needs round brackets. And in here, I'm just going to say, ouch, because that's what happens when you hit an enemy from a side. It hurts. So let's go ahead and try that out. I will do a Control S to save. If you need to pause the video, please note, of course, that this function is being pointed to by a signal. That's what these two little icons mean. And if I select the sides checker, we can see that the body entered is pointing to that. Same thing with the top checker. Again, that's pointing to that. Good. Okay, let's go back to level 1. Let's press play scene. And it seems to be working okay. If I run to the side of the enemy now, look what happens. It printed ouch there. Okay, it didn't do anything else, but it did print out. So if I go and hit the other side of the enemy, see it said ouch. And if I run into the side of this enemy, it prints ouch. And it seems to be working okay. So I don't know yet if I have to play with those collision layers and the collision masks. I think it seems to be working okay for now. So what do we want to have happen if you touch the side of the enemy as the player? Well, the easy thing to do, it would be just to go to a game over screen, or in our case, we're not going to switch to a game over screen because we don't have one yet, but you could just reset the level back to the beginning, and that's what we'll do right now. So I will select my enemies scene, and I will select or go into my enemies code. We are not just going to print out. In fact, before we publish our game, we'll get rid of any of these print method calls because those don't really work when you publish your game. They're just for the editor. But we will change our scene. Do you recall how to change the scene in Godot to reset the scene or switch to a different scene in your game? It is get_tree. That is a method call, so you need round brackets or parentheses if you're being correct about what you're calling them. And when you put getTree bracket, you put a dot, and you're going to say change spelt correctly, _scene, the first one, and then you're going to point to the path, including res : / the name of the scene that you want to switch to. In this case, we're switching to level 1. If you don't get this prompt like I did, you can just select the scene over in your file system doc in the words level1.tscn, and you'll get the path right there. You can just copy that, Control C after you select it, and put it in quotes over here, double quotes, of course, and paste, and then it should work. So let's do a Control S to save this. If you need to pause the video, please do. Get the code. Let's go ahead and go back to level 1 and press play scene. And now, as you can see, hopefully, when my enemy hits me, well, I switch scenes, and if I run to the side of the enemy, either from the front or the back, it should work. Now, some of you who are a little bit more experienced in Godot might know that there are ways that you can actually have a kinematic body object like the enemy. So it is a kinematic body 2D object. You don't have to have area 2Ds in order for it to detect other areas or detect collisions. Right now, we're kind of coding all of this enemy as if enemy objects, in other words, kinematic body 2D objects, don't have the capability to detect collisions built in. If I select the root node here and I go to the node signals doc, you can see there is no body entered or area entered objects here, but there is a way to check for collisions on a kinematic body 2D. I find they don't work as well, and I find that if the enemy is moving in the direction that it will hit you, then the collision would work if you were to use a kinematic body's collision detection that it has. But if you as the player accidentally run into the back of the enemy, it doesn't work so well, at least in terms of what I've found. So I find that just using Area 2Ds that are built into your enemy object that are following along with the enemy like we have, I just find this way works better. Okay, so we are getting there. We have a few more things to add. If I go back to level 1 and I play my scene and I jump on my enemy, well, it's not working exactly the way that I want, because if I land on my enemy, well, I, as the player, am falling down through the enemy, because when I jump on the enemy and I enter that top zone, you know, we're disabling some of the things in the enemy, but I'm actually falling into that side zone area too. So what I want to do is go back to my enemy's code, and when I enter the enemy's top checker, I'm turning off its collision for my player. Okay, I'm turning off the top checker's collision for my player, but because we now have another child of the enemy scene, we need to turn that off as well. So I'm just going to copy these two lines and I'll press enter, because when we enter the top zone, we want to turn off the side checker or sides checker as well. So I'm going to change this to a sides checker and sides checker, and that should do it. So if I do a Control S to save, of course, if you need to pause the video, please do. But I will go back to my level 1 and I will press play scene. And now if I land on an enemy, well, I just fall through, and that just works the way we want. Does sides collision still work? Yes, sides collisions do still work. Okay, so that seems to work pretty well. But when I squash my enemy, two things should happen that are not currently happening. Number one is I should be able to bounce off of my enemy. So let's go ahead and handle that. In my enemy, I'm going to select the root node. I'm going to press plus, because we're going to add a new type of node into our scene, a timer. A timer node is used to do a countdown or a repeated kind of tick, tick, tick. It can count or send out a signal on a timed increment, or you can just use it as like a stopwatch or a countdown timer that will sound. You can have it emit a signal whenever it runs out of its time. So I'm going to add a timer to my enemy. We'll just leave it called timer with a capital T. And when my timer runs out, I want the enemy scene, the whole enemy instance of the main enemy scene, to delete itself. Now, before we get to that though, let's go ahead and select the timer node and go to the inspector and look at what properties it has. It has a idle mode and a physics mode. We're not going to mess with that. We'll leave it on idle. We have a wait time, and this is how long the timer will count down for. If you play with this number, you can set how many seconds. It's in seconds it will count down for. I will just leave it at 1. If you only want a timer to run once, and then once it runs out, once it counts down to 0, at that point, if you want the timer to stop, then you will turn one shot on. If you don't turn one shot on, it will keep looping. So it will keep counting for 1 second at a time, and then it'll just reset and automatically count again and again and again in a loop. Okay, auto start is pretty self-explanatory. We don't want that because we want the timer to only be triggered to start when our player jumps on the enemy. So I've got 1 shot and wait time 1 second. What I want to do here is on my enemy's code, when the top checker body is entered, when the player jumps on the player, I want to start this timer. And then when the timer runs out after 1 second, I want the enemy to delete itself. So I'm going to do this in 2 parts. I'm going to start the timer when the top checker is entered by the character. So I'm going to put a $sign because I'm going to access the timer. So $sign timer with a capital T, it's the same name. And I'll put dot, and I'm going to put start. Now, this start is a method call, so you need to put round brackets or parentheses. And if you want to specify a time in seconds, you can do that. I could put 1 here, but I actually don't need to do that because the time that I'd be entering is actually the time that we set in its properties. Its wait time is here, so I can just put start without any parameters in those round brackets, I believe. So the timer has started. How do you make the timer do something when the timer runs out? Well, that's a signal, and so it's going to have another function that it calls when that signal is up. So I'm going to select my timer and I'm going to go to its node signals, and I'm going to say when it times out, it has this signal built into it. I'm going to double click on that, and it's going to put a function on my enemy's code called onTimerTimeout. And so it'll run this function when the timer counts down to 0. So I'll just press connect after I select enemy. And of course, it'll make a new function on my enemy's code at the bottom. We're going to say when the timer times out, we want the enemy to delete itself, which is a call to queue_free. Queue_free is the code. It's a method call, so you need your parentheses or round brackets. That should work, okay? So if your timer runs out, the enemy will delete itself, and that is triggered to start when your top checker is entered right there. I think we're good. I think you probably have it. If you need to pause the video and catch up, please do. But I'll do a Control S to save. I'll go back to level 1. I'll press play scene. So now if I jump on my enemy, the enemy disappears after a second. If you don't like that time, you can go back to your enemy scene, select the timer, go to your inspector and turn this down or up. I think 0.5 is a nicer amount of time. It's quicker. The enemy will disappear pretty quick. So if I go back to level 1 and I go back to play scene and I jump on the enemy, well, it'll disappear pretty quick. You can decide on your own wait time. Is the scene restarting itself? I'm not sure why that is, but we will keep going and I will solve that. Actually, let's go ahead and see if we turn off I'll go back to my enemy scene. That might be happening because something is entering the sides checker of our enemy, which triggers when you enter. It prints out to the screen, which it did. Something entered the side of an enemy. And it wasn't the enemy that I just squashed, so it was changing the scene. That's the only thing that changes the scene right now, except for collecting all 3 coins, which we obviously didn't do. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to my Sides Checker Area2D, and it is on the collision layer of the enemies. I don't think we actually need that. If we turn it off and I do a Control S to save, this sides checker will still be found, or it'll still be looking for the player. So it'll still be able to collide and detect collisions with the player. The player can no longer find it necessarily in its code because the enemy's sides checker is not on a collision layer itself. But I think that'll solve any problems because I think perhaps that this sides checker was maybe colliding with the ground or something like that. Let's go ahead and see what this does. I'll save this enemy scene. Remember that we're working inside the enemy scene when we turn that off. If I go back to level 1 though and press play scene, well, if I squash an enemy, it disappears. Let's wait a moment and see if our scene resets. I have a feeling that it was to do with this corner here and the enemy falling off and the size checker kind of colliding with that little zone there. But I think it's good now. I don't think we're having that problem anymore. So I think that was it. And I think I confirmed that when I practiced this tutorial. Last but not least, actually we have a few more things to do. We want to make our player do a little bounce. When we land on the enemy, we should do a little hop. So let's handle that. Back into my enemy, I will go into my enemy's code. When the top checker is entered by my player, I should call a function on my player to tell my player to do a little bounce. So we have access to whatever body enters the top checker of the enemy, and so if I put that body code, if I put that body reference right here, I can call a function on the body by putting a dot, and then if that body has a method called, or a function called bounce, which we're about to make, it will run the bounce method. Of course, I can access any property of the body by putting a dot and then putting the property name. In this case, we're calling the function bounce, which we don't have yet. So if I were to save the enemy scene, if you need to pause the video, please do, and go back to level 1, we would actually cause our game to crash. So now if I jump on the enemy, well, again, the program will crash because it says invalid call, non-existent function bounce in base kinematic body 2D Steve.gd. So it didn't find a bounce method or function in Steve's code. So let's go ahead and add that. I'll close this window. I'll press the stop button. That's important to do. And then I will go to the code of Steve and add the bounce function. So I'll go to Steve's script here. When you edit the script of this instance of Steve, it'll just edit the steve.gd original code file. So that's what we want. That's good. So I have my physics process delta function here, which is my main game loop on Steve. If I scroll down, we have one other function. It is the fall zone checker. So if our player enters the fall zone, well, we are resetting the game. But we want to make our own custom bounce function down here as well below either of those two functions. So I'll go to the end of this line. I'll press enter a few times and backspace. So I'm lining up my code or my cursor with the beginning of the line, same as the func above it. And I will type func because we're making our own custom bounce, B-O-U-N-C-E function here. When you write a function, you always need round brackets, even if you don't use them. And then you need a colon. And then whatever you put below that line that is indented, it will be a part of that function. It'll be the body of that function's code, essentially. In this case, if I land on the top of an enemy, I want my player to do a little jump automatically without me pressing any key on my keyboard. How do you jump? Well, you're going to be affecting your player's Y velocity. In other words, if you do a jump, if you press the jump action button and you're on the floor, you make your velocity.y equal to your player's jump force. And jump force here is a constant. It is negative 1100. Now, if I do a bounce by jumping on an enemy, the top of an enemy, I don't want to do a full force jump. In other words, I don't want to go quite as high up. But what I will do is I will copy that line, Control C. I'll paste it here, indented, of course, tabbed once in. But I will divide or multiply jump force by a number that's less than 1. So I will type 0.7 or something like that. So the jump won't be quite as high. It'll be 70% of its normal height. So if I do a Control S to save, I think I should have it. I will do a Control S and play my level 1 scene again. So now if I jump on the enemy, hey, I do a little hop. Is that the right height of hop? I'm not entirely sure, and I can adjust that 0.7 to something else if I don't like it, but I think 0.7 is okay for me. Likewise, if you hit an enemy right now, I'll go back to my level 1 scene and I'll press play scene. I'll hit the side of an enemy. I don't just want to reset my scene necessarily. This is a little bit optional. If you run into the side of an enemy, I'm going to make my player turn translucent red, and my player is also going to jump in the direction based on, I think, where you are in relation to the enemy. So if you are to the left of the enemy, you should jump to the left. If you're to the right of the enemy, hitting the enemy, you should jump back and up to the right. So in other words, if I go to my enemy's script, if you enter the side checker, where is that? If I zoom out on my code, top checker, size checker, body entered. Right now we are printing out to the screen. I don't mind that. We are changing our scene back to level 1. I'm going to get rid of that. And instead on my body, this is the body that enters the sides checker, I'm going to call a method or function called, not bounce this time, we're going to make one called ouch. It's a good name. I can't think of a better one, but there we go. So now that should work, assuming that we actually make that ouch function on our Steve character. So I'll do a Control S to save my enemy code. I'll go back to Steve's code. We're going to make a function called bounce, again, lined up here, func ouch, not bounce, ouch. And ouch is going to need, of course, some body code. So I'll press enter and make sure I'm indented once, like before. When I am hit, when my Steve character, I'm editing Steve's code right now, when I'm hit by an enemy on the side, I want to change my color In other words, I want to make Steve look a little bit more red and a little bit more transparent. We can do that using Steve's. I'll go back to my level 1 and actually go to Steve's scene. Steve is right here. I'll click on his little scene icon. If I look at Steve's root node, I can edit the visibility modulate setting in code. And this is actually pretty easy to do. Right now, if I just do this in the interface, if I click on this little color picker and pick a kind of a ready color, and then maybe turn down this A slider, which means red, green, blue, A is for alpha, you can make him transparent. So I'll turn these all back up to 255. That means they're all their natural color of that sprite. So I'll go back to Steve's script, back to my script workspace. What I can do is set underscore modulate. And this is a method call, so it needs parentheses or round brackets. And in here, we have to tell the set modulate what this color should be. Now, if you want to describe a color in code, it requires that you make a new color variable, essentially. So we put color with a capital C, and if you are British or Canadian, you are spelling color with no U. You're spelling it the American way with a capital C. And I'm going to put some parentheses here because color needs an RGB, a red, green, and blue value, as well as optionally an alpha value, so RGB and A. So these all go in these round brackets with commas between them. So if I just put 1, 1, 1, 1, that would not change the color at all because this just all means white in here. When you have all these RGB turned up to 1, that's their fullest value. When you make a new color object, it just means that all the colors are there, which means we're not going to be affecting the modulation. Instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to leave red turned up, but I'm going to take away some of the green and the blue. So I'm going to turn these down to 0.3 and 0.3. When you leave the red turned up and when you turn down green and blue, it'll look more red. And if I turn this alpha value down to 0.3 or 0.4, you can choose, you will be making the sprite or the entire Steve character look more transparent. So if I do a Control S to save, and if you need to pause the video, please do. But if I go to level 1 and I press play scene, well, if I run into the side of my enemy, I will turn transparent red. Next, we need our Steve to do a little bounce and do a bounce backwards. So I'm going to make my Steve do a jump up, and then we'll decide how to make him go side to side. So on my Steve's script, I'm going to make Steve do a little bounce, and we'll use the same code here. I'll do a Control C to copy. I'll paste that indented, of course, right there. I might want the bounce to be a little bit less dramatic, so maybe half of the normal jump force bounce height. And so if I do a Control S to save and I go back to level 1, I will go and play my scene. So now if I hit the side, I I jump up, but then of course when I land, I enter that top zone. So that's not what I want. So now we have a problem because we have this Steve's ouch function that knows how to edit properties and see properties of Steve because this code and this function is on Steve. But now I want to say, if Steve is to the left of the blob enemy, I'll go back to my level 1. If Steve is to the left of the blob and it hits that side, I want Steve to jump to the left and up, of course. And if he's over here to the right of the blob, I want him to jump that way or get thrown kind of that way. Right now, though, inside of Steve's code, it has no idea what object hit it, or therefore where that object is in relation to Steve's coordinate. So really, Steve needs to know the coordinate of the enemy, or at least the X coordinate of the enemy that hit it, in order for it to jump in the right direction. So I'm going to go back to my code. I'll go back to my script workspace and go back to my enemy. Right now, when my enemy detects, or its sides checker detects that my character entered it, it calls this body.ouch function. but it does not send this body.ouch function any information. In other words, a parameter in the round brackets. I'm going to fix that now. I'm actually going to send Steve through the parameters of the ouch function this own objects, this enemy's x coordinate, which I can send by just saying position.x. You can send a parameter to a function that function will then have access to, even if that code is somewhere else on some other object, by putting that information here. Okay, so we're essentially sending the body ouch function a number. Okay, and it happens to be the number that is the current position at the time of collision of the enemy's x position. Okay, what are we going to do with that? Well, I have to first implement it in my ouch function, so I'll save that code. If you need to pause the video and get that code, please do. But I will go back to Steve, because on this Steve, we have an ouch function, but it's not expecting right now any parameters, and we need to program that. So I'm going to have to put here a new variable declaration to accept a parameter that's being sent to it. So I'm going to write var, that's how you create a variable, of course, and I'm going to call it posex. All one word, you cannot put spaces in a variable name, so that's what we want. Maybe I'll say enemy posex. That's kind of long, but I think it does the job. It describes it pretty well. So now we're going to say, because we in our Steve code have access to the x position of the enemy that just hit it, we're going to say, well, we're not just going to jump up and down. I'm going to go below here. If position, this is my Steve's position now, because I'm just typing position and not enemy posex, dot x is less than enemy posex. In other words, am I to the left of the enemy? Because when your position .x is less than the enemy's position x, that means you are to the left of the enemy. I'm going to put a colon right there, and I'll press enter. If I'm to the left of the enemy when I hit the enemy, I want to jump to the left. So I'm going to say, I'm going to make my velocity .x, this is me now telling my velocity .x to do something. I'm going to make it equal to, and this is where I'm going to play around with numbers. I'm going to try negative 800, and that's going to be quite like a sideways jump, essentially. But I'm going to press enter and backspace to line up again with my if, because I'm going to say otherwise if, or else if, or elif for short in GD script. I'm going to say position dot x is going to be greater than, if it's greater than enemy pos x, then I want to jump in the other direction. So I'm going to say velocity dot x is going to be equal to 800. Okay, so jump in the opposite direction. Now, we can try this out. In fact, let's do that, but we're going to run into a problem here, and you'll see it in just a moment. I'll do a Control S to save. Of course, if you need to pause the video, please do if you need to get the code, but I will go back to my level 1 scene and press play scene. And so now if I run into the side of an enemy, I jump, and that looks pretty good. If I jump into the other side of an enemy, well, I'm still that red color, so maybe I should stop the game and go back and try getting hit by there. So that works pretty well. It works on the right side, going in the right direction. But if I restart my game, what I'll find is that if I'm already walking and I walk into the enemy, because I'm pressing that arrow key down and I'm moving to the right, that me pressing an arrow key to the left or to the right will override me being thrown back in the right direction. So if I'm standing still, I'll get thrown. But if I'm walking, I'll just keep kind of going in that direction, because my speed is going to override that throw back direction or throw forward direction. So what I want to do here is actually disable the player, the person who's playing the game, their player's input. So if they're pressing a key on the keyboard to make the player move, we're going to actually stop that from working until they let go and press the button again. So I'm going to go back to my Steve script, and what I'm going to do here is I'll press enter and backspace to line up my cursor again. What I'm going to do is I'm going to type input with a capital I. This is how you can affect input things, just like we did to make input check for an action pressed earlier on. So what I'm going to do here is say action underscore release. and this will release any actions that are currently being pressed. I want to release either left or right, depending on which one is being pressed, if either of them are being pressed. So left, and I'll press enter, input dot action release, and I'm going to say right in double quotes, of course. So that should work for that. If I do a Control S to save, of course, if you need to pause the video, please do to get this code out for yourself. But I will go back to my level 1 scene and I will press play scene. And now if I get hit by the enemy, I get thrown back. And if I run into the enemy, well, I can no longer move until I let go and I press left or right again. Okay, that isn't necessarily totally ideal because once I get thrown back, I'm still holding the right arrow key and it's not letting me move until I let go, and that is a little bit weird. Maybe I'll change that in a future video, but I think we're doing pretty well, except I want to die or reset my scene once I get thrown back. The problem is, when I get hit like I currently am, I want to turn red, I want to get thrown back, and I want to wait a second before I switch back to my game level again to reset my game or go to a game over screen. So I don't want to just die automatically. So what I'm going to do is go to my Steve scene and I'm going to add a timer just like before. Okay, this is how you make a delay in your game. So in my Steve scene, I'll select the root node, I'll press plus. I'm going to add a timer. Hey, I've already searched for it, so there it is. I'll double click on timer. What I'm going to do is after 1 second, I'll leave it at 1 and I can adjust it later. And we're going to make it a one-shot timer because you can only die once. And then the game will restart itself, at least for now. So we have a timer, and once it runs out, we want to have the game reset to level 1. So with my timer selected, I'll go to my node dock. I'll go to the timeout signal and I'll double click. We're going to select the root node of Steve. This is what we have our code on in our Steve scene, and it's going to make a new receiver method, a function called onTimerTimeout. With Steve selected, I'll press connect. I'm not going to change that name. Now Steve has a method called onTimerTimeout, and when the timer does time out, in other words, we've been hit, we are going to start this timer. We haven't done that yet. We then want to change the scene, which of course is get_tree parentheses dot change scene, and of course we want to reset our game to level 1.tscn. This timer is not going to start though until we tell it to start, and we have not done that yet. Just a second though, let's go ahead and check to see our timer has the timeout calling and running this function, which is, if I double click on it, it'll take me right there on line 60 of my Steve.gd script. Okay, so if I am hurt as Steve, I will and eventually run this ouch function, in which I will be thrown in one direction. I will disable the user's left and right actions. At this point, I'm going to start the timer. So I'm going to say $timer dot, and I'm going to type start. And that is a method call, so we're going to put our parentheses there. That should work. Okay, so I'll press Control S to save, and I will go back to level 1. If you need to, of course, pause the video to get this code for yourself, please do. But I will press play scene. And now if I get hit by an enemy, well, I'm thrown back. It waits for a second and then it resets the game level. And you might want to play with that timer's countdown value, or the timer value. I can't quite recall what it's called. This timer's wait time. So if I change this to 0.7 or something like that in the Steve scene, and I save it and I go back to level 1 and I press play scene, now I probably won't land, or just as I land, it will, oh, that didn't quite work as expected. So it seems to work 99% of the time, or so at least for me. Okay, I was in this video going to add a bottom checker to my enemy, because if you have an enemy that falls down on top of you, you don't want it to just land on you like a kinematic body 2D. You want it to basically have the enemy maybe do a little bounce if it lands on you. And so you might want to have the enemy have a bottom checker. And if that bottom checker hits you in the head, you should still die. And that means you should probably have that ouch method called as well, but I'm going to leave that up to you. I might add that between this and the next video just to save on this video's length. So that will be it for this video. As it stands, we have enemies now that you can customize to go in one direction or the other initially. We now have the ability to squash enemies and they wait a second and then they disappear. And if you hit the enemy from the side, you will get thrown back and you will turn red, transparent, and then it'll wait and then it'll reset the scene. One last thing, if I want to make enemies a different color, depending on if they have a different behavior, and this is something that I thought about around the time that I was planning for the last video, some of your enemies, depending if I select the enemy, have the ability to detect cliffs. And so this enemy one right here does not have detects cliffs turned on, and therefore it'll fall off of a cliff. Whereas these ones, if I select enemy 2, which is this one, it will detect a cliff. Let's see about enemy 3. This one will as well. And that's not good video game design because you can't tell the difference as the player between these two things. And so you might expect, once you see this one fall off an edge, you might expect this one to also fall off the cliff once it gets to over here, and it won't, it'll turn around. So ideally, this type of enemy would be different in appearance than this one. So we're going to actually set up in our enemy very quickly. If I go back to my enemies scene and I go back to my enemies code, if that variable called detects cliffs is either not true or true, we're going to use that color modulation to change the color of that enemy. So some enemies will be a different color based on if they can detect cliffs or not. This is going to happen in our ready function right when the game first starts. I'm going to make an if statement. I'm going to say if detects cliffs is true, and you can just put if detects cliffs. I'm going to put my colon there and I'll press enter. We're going to call that set underscore modulate method, which needs parentheses, of course. And when you call set modulate, you have to put a color in here. So I'm going to type color with a capital C, C-O-L-O-R, and I'll put my parentheses here. And just like before on our player, we need 4 values, or you can just use 3 for red, green, and blue if you don't need to change the alpha as well. So if I put 1, 1, 1, that will modulate this player's look with white, which will not change it at all. So if I do a Control S to save, if you need to pause the video, please do. I will go back to my level 1 and press play scene. You know, they're all the same color still. Now, if the enemy, I'll go back to my enemy scene and go back to my enemy's code. If the enemy can detect a cliff, I'm going to change these 3 numbers to 1.2, 0.5, 1. So we are turning up the red, turning down the green, and leaving the blue at its normal level. Typically, you leave these or you change these numbers with a value between 0 and 1. So we're actually turning red up too high. We're adding more red than there naturally would be, but I think that's okay. Let's go ahead and see what this looks like. If I do a Control S to save, I will go to my level 1 and press play scene. And so now some of the enemies are purple and some are their original color. And of course, you could put your own code change to change the color for both types if you want. So now I can tell that these 2 enemies might do something different. The ones that are purple will not fall off of a cliff, and the ones that are blue aren't as smart and they will fall off the cliff. Okay, so that will be it for this video. Lots of code and setting things up in this video, but I will leave my enemies code up on the screen right now, and I will switch over to steve.gd, in which we have more code. So there's the top of Steve's code, and there's the bottom of Steve's code. But that will be it for this video. Of course, if you like this video or if you learned something in it, please go ahead and click on that like button below this video. It really helps out me and my channel. And if you want to see more videos like this one in the Godot game engine or in Blender or other technology, click on that subscribe button as well, and click the bell icon to be notified whenever I upload a new tutorial. Check out my Facebook page and my Instagram page. In those 2 places, I post sneak peeks and previews of what I'm working on next. That's where I communicate with you guys the most, other than on YouTube. But that'll be it for this video. Thanks for watching. We'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.